Good morning or good evening, depending on which part of the world you are. My name is James Lau. I'm from the Prince of Wales Hospital, Chinese University of Hong Kong. I have a lot of pleasure in chairing this webinar. This is the third talk to this series organized by the research committee. Joining me in the panel are Professor Dwyer from University of Milwaukee. He's very well known. He's one of the master endoscopists. He's very active in educations and traveling to Africa and Asia to teach. He's very well published. He's published more than 200 manuscripts, and the latest being an article in the journal Lancet on regeneration of a large defect in the esophagus. So he's joining me this evening as one of the panels. The other panelist is Dr. Moura. He's from São Paulo, Brazil. He's a professor there. He's a very well-known interventional endoscopist. He's interested in endoscopic obesity surgery, ERCPs. So he's also very well published, over 200 peer-reviewed articles. And our speaker this evening is Dr. Prasad Iyer. He's from Mayo Clinic in Rochester. He graduated from the medical school at All India Institute in New Delhi. He completed his residency in Wisconsin and also fellowship at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, where he became also a faculty and a consultant. He's been there since 2006. He's a professor to the Barrett's esophagus unit. And this is exactly where his research interest is. And he's well-funded from the NIH for his research in Barrett's esophagus. Again, he's also prolific in publications. He has published over 200 peer-reviewed articles, and he's been a reviewer for many journals. Let us welcome Prasad. He's going to speak to us on the tips and tricks of getting published. Thank you, Dr. Prasad.
Thank you, Dr. Lau, for that kind introduction. Can you hear me okay? So I'm going to present about 20 to 24 slides in the next, hopefully 25 minutes or so. And I hope that that will provide us with a good introduction in terms of starting a discussion on how best to publish a research manuscript. So I'm just going to share my slide. I'll just go into presentation mode here. There you go. So I'm Prasad Iyer. I work at the Mayo Clinic. I've also had the opportunity to be associate editor for gastrointestinal endoscopy over the last 7 years. Let's get started. So we know that publishing research manuscripts has long been an essential metric of academic success and performance. And of course, as the years have progressed, the pressure to publish, particularly in high impact journals, has increased. And indeed, publishing research in journals which have good impact factors has become much more challenging given the overall increase, I would call it an exponential increase in academic productivity and scientific output over the last several years. I'm hoping that in the next 20 to 25 minutes, I will share some of my insights on how to publish manuscripts, taking advantage of my experience as an associate editor for gastrointestinal endoscopy over the last 7 years. So why should we publish research? I think this is the critical point. Really, I think there are several objectives. So the first is to improve patient care through better tests and treatments. And publication allows us the ability to share with colleagues and investigators what works and what does not work. So again, we place a lot of emphasis on positive results, but I think sharing negative results is equally important so that investigators across the world are not duplicating effort in terms of treatments or diagnostic tests which may not work. It's also important for us to understand why diseases occur, understanding the pathophysiology, the pathogenesis of disease, and this goes more to basic science. And of course, as I alluded to in my previous slide, publications still remain the academic currency and oftentimes are the metric by which promotion, whether it be from an assistant to an associate professor to a professor, is oftentimes assessed. And finally, and not in the least, I think publications also provide us with a sense of professional and oftentimes personal reward as such, in terms of having an academic reputation, gaining some prestige, being invited to present at meetings. And of course, when we travel, and I know that in the age of COVID, travel has been severely curtailed, but we continue to meet at least over the web via these webinars, which we are part of. It also allows us to make connections and hopefully develop some friendships. And I've had the distinct pleasure of having that experience as well. So what are some types of publications? And I think it's important for us to distinguish between these. And in this slide, I have tried to divide the kind of publications which are published in journals. So at the top, we have the crown jewel, which is the original scientific paper. And I have followed that down with systematic reviews and meta-analyses, editorials, which oftentimes are invited, abstracts, which we write. The DDW abstract deadline just passed, and I'm sure many of you have contributed. And then we have case reports, book chapters, and non-peer-reviewed journals as well. And on the right-hand side, I have tried to put the workload that is associated with these types of publications and the professional value. And I would probably say that the professional value and workload for the first three types of publications is very high on both ends. Now, when we start moving down the list, we will go down on the workload that might be necessary and the professional value. So though abstracts give you a lot of visibility, finally, when we look at the value that they provide, it's just a teaser of what might come. And really the value of an abstract, I think, is to just highlight some of the more important aspects of your research. And really most of it, the impact comes from a final publication. And of course, as we go down in terms of case reports and book chapters, the value decreases. Predatory journals are something that we should all be aware of. And these are journals which unfortunately have started where the workload might actually be high, but publication might actually even have a low to maybe even a negative value because you're really not being subjected to peer review, and the value might actually decrease. So this has been my journey in terms of publishing, and as Dr. Lau has kindly alluded to, I've published probably over 200 papers now, and I have to say many of them were initially rejected. So I don't think there is any shame in admitting this, because I think we all should expect to get rejected or be asked to revise our submissions when we first submit a paper. And I think the secret to success, and this is something that we'll talk about in the discussion as well, is that you have to have persistence, be open to criticism, be open to revising your manuscripts, because by and large, I would say peer review leads to constructive criticism and improvement of the final product. And of course, you need patience and persistence. I do believe that if you write a manuscript and it is reasonably well written, you're very likely to find a home, because all journal editors and journals realize that true knowledge is really valuable. So what are some criteria for acceptance in journals? And at least as an associate editor for gastrointestinal endoscopy, we think of every paper that we deal with under these three headings. So first is, what is the scientific rigor of the study that is being described in the manuscript? So the rigor really comes down to study design. And we are all aware of the pyramid of the levels of evidence, with randomized controlled trials and systematic reviews and meta-analyses being at the top of the pyramid, and then coming down to observational studies like cohort studies, case control studies, and then retrospective studies, and then of course case series. So it's that pyramid of evidence. And of course, when we see a prospective controlled trial or a prospective cohort with well-defined inclusion and exclusion criteria, you are going to get a higher priority for publication. The second big category is novelty. And this is where we look for new methods, new observations. I think confirmatory studies which are confirming prior published data are less attractive. But I do feel that if they are well done, and at least in the initial few studies, if they are confirmatory, because every study that is published needs validation, they definitely have value. And the third criteria is relevance. What is the relevance to the journal's audience? So you really have to look at which field of gastroenterology and hepatology your study is falling into, because journals tend to prioritize depending on their mission. So is this endoscopy specific? Is this gastroenterology versus hepatology? Is this something that is relevant to a national audience or an international audience? And I think all of this will factor into the journal that you may want to target. So let's start on some tips on writing a paper, and I'm open to comments on this. This is typically how I would start writing a paper. Typically, once a study is completed, the first thing we typically do is to write an abstract, which typically goes into a major meeting like Digestive Disease Week, the American College of Gastroenterology, UEGW, the WEO meeting. And this really summarizes the entire paper and usually has several hundred words. When you start with a manuscript, I typically will start with the methods and the results. And this is where you would start with putting together some of the key figures and tables. And the methods really can flow just from the protocol, which you hopefully have already written. And the method should be detailed enough to understand for a reviewer and for a reader to understand, and if needed, reproduce. The introduction and the discussion really then flow from the methods and the results sections. The introduction really should be short, typically a page, not more than a page and a half of double-spaced print, and typically 3 to 4 paragraphs, summarizing why did you do the study and explain the significance of your study, identify the gaps in knowledge, and very quickly come to how you are aiming to fill those gaps, which are really the aims of the paper. What are some things to avoid while writing a manuscript? I think the first thing is to avoid overstating your conclusions. Avoid terms like this is definitive proof, beyond all doubt. I think reviewers like to see a sense of practicality within the context of your study. What are the conclusions? What could be the limitations? I think that is an important thing to oftentimes outline in the discussion particularly. Do not claim to be the first, the largest, or the biggest. I think these are claims that are difficult to verify. Length is, again, something that as an associate editor, I really look at. And the most important thing, of course, now is to stay within word limits that the journals have. Remember, this is not a review article, and brevity is oftentimes underappreciated. Always follow journal instructions. If you don't, then the editorial staff will oftentimes send this back to you and not even send this over for peer review. And then, of course, something that I'll come to at the end also is to avoid the appearance of commercial bias and avoid trade names. It's always okay to maybe begin with maybe a single mention of the trade name, but really then go to a generic description. So for instance, lumen opposing stents would be a good description for the Axio stent. Circumferential or focal radiofrequency ablation would be a good term to use instead of the commercial terms such as Bararex. How do you choose a journal? So you've written your paper, you've conducted your study, you've written your paper, and now you have to figure out which journal to go to. As most of you know, there are over 70 gastrointestinal and gastroenterology journals which are listed on PubMed. And really, I think the choice should be based on readership and relevance. I've just tried to highlight different areas within gastroenterology, and we have the luxury of having multiple journals. If you're really thinking about general gastroenterology, you could target gastroenterology, gut, clinical gastroenterology and hepatology, American Journal. These tend to have a wider audience. If your research is really endoscopy based, then I think you should be thinking about endoscopy journals like endoscopy, gastrointestinal endoscopy, surgical endoscopy. There are journals specific to the colon, to the esophagus, to the pancreas. And then a consideration which is a practical consideration is the impact factor of the journal. And you really have to tie what you assess as the significance and impact of your research with the impact factor of journals. So typically, if the impact factor is more than 10, these journals tend to be very selective. If it is somewhere between 5 and 10, they tend to be less selective, but still they are reasonably selective. And then, of course, the lower the impact factor, the easier likely it is going to be able to get into the journal. It also is important in my mind to see what journals have published similar papers. So when you are doing your review of the literature and writing your discussion, you would have an idea of the studies that you are actually citing. And that is where it's important to see the reference list. Understand the scope of the journal. So you don't want to submit an epidemiology paper into an endoscopy paper, an endoscopy journal, because the editors are likely not going to be very receptive. Also check with co-authors and mentors and get an idea of what their opinion is in terms of which journal to target. Now, one point I would like to make is that, and I do this as well, you may want to start with a reach journal. And by a reach journal, I mean a journal which you may think may be highly selective with a very high impact factor, like say gut or gastroenterology. While it does take some effort to submit your journal, your manuscript to these journals, even if your manuscript is rejected, the reviews might be very helpful in revising your paper and getting it resubmitted to a journal which may have a lower impact factor. And the other thing to not forget is that sometimes, depending on what the reviewers feel, if it's high, if the priority is not high enough to publish in the highest impact factor journal, you could still be offered a transfer to some of these overflow journals, which are also very high impact and have a wider readership. So for instance, gastroenterology may transfer your manuscript to clinical gastroenterology and hepatology. American Journal of Gastroenterology may offer transfer to clinical and translational gastroenterology. And the advantage is that you could just respond to the reviewer comments that you originally got, and you don't have to, your paper may not be sent out for review again. Gastrointestinal endoscopy, again, may offer transfer to video GIE. And of course, impact factor is, I think, something that we all focus on. And I would like to submit that it is only one of the many measures of quality among scientific journals. And the definition of impact factor is the average number of citations to articles, to citable articles in the journal in the previous 2 years after publication. And one should not forget that there are many other measures of journal quality, such as measures of education consumption, something called Plum metrics, which measure web downloads, mentions on traditional social media, And these are also summarized into metrics called alt metrics. So this is just a summary of some of the higher impact journals in the gastroenterology fields. Journals which focus on reviews tend to have high impact factors, but again, as you can see, the top 3 journals are hepatology, which really focuses on liver disease, gut, and gastroenterology, followed by Lancet Gastroenterology and Hepatology. And then, as I mentioned, Clinical Gastroenterology and Hepatology, American Journal of Gastroenterology, Endoscopy, and GI Endoscopy are sort of in the next group. And then you have APT, and then you go down from there. Another thing I think that is important to realize is with our global reach, particularly for several journals, the WEO journals, gastrointestinal endoscopy, a number of non-native English speakers are increasingly writing manuscripts. So we get a lot of, in GI endoscopy, we get a lot of journals, manuscripts from Japan, Korea, China, Latin America. The instruction we typically give to our editors is that editors should try to focus most of their attention on the scientific content. How well a study is designed? How was it done? What are the results? Unfortunately, I should note that if the grammar or English is not adequate, it may make comprehension of the results and the significance somewhat challenging. So this is something that may operate in the background, and this is where I think authors should be at least aware of some of the editing and translational services that might be available. So some of them are commercially available. I know Elsevier provides services in that regard. You could also approach colleagues or friends or collaborators who could take a look at the manuscript before it is submitted and maybe edited from a grammatical perspective. So just something to keep in mind. Now, you've done your study, you've written your manuscript, you've identified a journal, and you've submitted the journal. So how does peer review work? And this can sometimes be a bit challenging to negotiate. The goal of peer review is to get is exactly that. So it's sent out to peers, and peers are investigators who have experience and expertise in the area of the manuscript. And the review is focused on critically appraising the rationale for the study design, the analyses, and then the discussion. So really, it is meant to have an expert review in terms of all of these aspects. And of course, reviewers, unfortunately, because of the volume of manuscripts that come and the space that is available, are really looking for reasons why a paper may not be suitable for the journal. But I think the overall goal of peer review is to provide constructive feedback. Now, unfortunately, sometimes peer review is not the easiest to negotiate, and biases, unfortunately, do operate, and there are active discussions, and some journals have actually now gone to double-blind peer reviews, where not only are the authors blinded to the identity of the peer reviewers, but the peer reviewers themselves are also blinded to the authors. So there is no bias on either end. And some journals have actually adopted this approach, and I think it has the opportunity, the possibility of moving forward. So this is just a brief summary of how peer review can work. So the first thing is to upload your paper. Typically, all submissions now are online. There are websites, and this is where the first review goes from the editorial staff in terms of meeting the author instructions. At least in GI endoscopy, it then goes to editorial or associate editorial review, and about 40 to 50% of manuscripts, unfortunately, and this will depend on the selectivity of the journal, are not sent out for review. And I think this is just to make the whole process more efficient. This can happen from 2 days to 7 days. If it meets that first review bar, then reviewers are with relevant expertise, and there are databases of reviewers that we use, are invited, typically 2 or 3, and this takes somewhere from 2 to 4 weeks. And decisions typically are either to reject, to revise, which could be a major revision, a minor revision, or accept. And I think an accept decision at the first submission is extremely unusual, unless it's a case report or something like that. Assuming that you are invited to revise and resubmit the manuscript, I would suggest at this time that you make every effort to accommodate the reasonable suggestions of reviewers, unless they're telling you to do things like double the sample size or recruit more patients, things like that. And this typically should take about 2 to 4 weeks. And then you resubmit your paper. It goes out to a quick peer review. This is typically a week or 2 at the most. And this should lead to either acceptance or minor revision, and the whole process can get completed. So I would say that from the time you submit to the time hopefully you get accepted, the review, this process should be somewhere between 2 and 3 months. I think that is a quick summary again, and these are some of the acceptance rates in gastrointestinal endoscopy. And again, this is very, very selective now, given the volume of papers that we actually get. As you can see, original articles are in the low teens, new methods are in the low teens, systematic reviews and meta-analyses are less than 10%. The letters, of course, there are not too many that we get, so many of them do get in. So as you can see, this is just an idea to get a sense of what the level of selectivity is. What are some mistakes that result in rejection? So rigor, I'm going to go through again those 3 things: rigor, relevance, and novelty. So rigor, things like the absence of a control group. I think this is becoming more and more important. Case series, straight case series, unfortunately, get lower prevalence, a lower priority. Absence of a formal sample size or power estimation. Unclear definition of variables. You have not defined who should be included, who has been excluded. Adverse events are not being prospectively assessed or are not being defined very well. Relevance, I think this is where choice of the right journal is very important. There's no point submitting an epidemiology paper to gastrointestinal endoscopy or endoscopy. Novelty, if you are just the 4th or the 5th repeat study, this is less likely to be attractive to reviewers, particularly, and to editors, particularly in higher impact journals. Now, we all have to deal with this. What to do with a paper that is rejected? You are not getting the ability to revise, and I think all of us on this call have gone through this. I think the first thing is to take a deep breath and do not take this personally, even though it's hard. I typically like to read the review 1 day after I get them, because the first day I feel that I may not be very objective in terms of receiving some of the criticisms. Look for fixable issues and revise the paper to the extent that you can. Remember, you don't know who the reviewer is, and the next journal, it might go to the same reviewer. So try and fix some of the things that are fixable. So if there are suggestions on methods to analyze the data, if there are suggestions on additional analyses, if there are suggestions on shortening some of the sections, adding more figures or tables. Do not forget to obtain feedback from other co-authors, and then always resubmit to another journal after you've revised it to the extent that is possible. This is something that I have learned over the years. Appeals. I think appeals are extremely unlikely to work. Unless the reviewer has made some serious factual mistake, I don't think that an appeal is very likely to work. And I think you are better served by revising your manuscript and going to the next journal. Other mistakes I'm going to highlight, I think these are more recent concepts. Plagiarism, I'll talk about this in the next few slides. Conflict of interest, you want to disclose your conflict of interest. duplicate publications, inclusion of patients in multiple publications. This has actually led to some retractions. And then clinical trials, very important to register in clinical trials databases. This is something that has become almost an essential criterion for publishing clinical trials. I would encourage you to read this article on ethics in publication, which was written by both Mike Wallace and Peter Siersema, editors-in-chief of GI Endoscopy and Endoscopy, which highlight some of these mistakes. So plagiarism, again, is defined as the act of using another person's words or ideas without giving credit to that person. And this is just an example of a software that is used by gastrointestinal endoscopy, which not only identifies the overlap, but actually tells the reviewer or the editor, where did that language come from? So be very careful when you are writing manuscripts. And oftentimes, if the index exceeds a certain threshold, and we feel that this is being plagiarized, then you need to, this will be sent back to the author with questions. And if confirmed, there are serious consequences such as suspension or notification of the department chair or institution. So one needs to be very aware of this. Conflict of interest. This is defined as a situation in which a person is or appears to be, I underline this. So even the appearance of conflict is important, of acting in a biased way because of personal interests. And this was a nice article in JAMA in 2017. It clearly states that authors should state their relationships with all people, companies, and organizations. Disclosures can occur in person or through statements published online or in print. And the important thing is that being open to the perception of conflict of interest allows everyone, including readers, patients, and the public, to judge for themselves whether a particular relationship may be influencing here a doctor's actions or for publication, the author's words. And of course, in the United States, we have databases which allow us to actually look for commercial conflicts. So it's always best to disclose both relevant and perceived and maybe even non-relevant conflicts: research funding, consulting, personal compensation, speakers bureau. What is the sponsor's involvement in design, conduct of study, analysis, and writing? Because remember that even the perception of bias is going to impact the interpretation of results. So in conclusion, publications are the lifeblood of academic practice. I think manuscripts are assessed by three major criteria: their novelty, the rigor, and the relevance. I would encourage you to pick the most appropriate journal, see critiques constructively. Persistence and perseverance is critical in improving the manuscript and getting your work published. I think keys to success are to write. I think writing begets more writing and improves your skills. And be always aware of pitfalls like conflict of interest and plagiarism. Thank you so much. I'd also like to acknowledge Dr. Mike Wallace for sharing his presentation on a similar topic with me. And we are open to any questions or discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prasad. Excellent talk, very comprehensive. Let me just remind the participants, if you have burning questions to ask, you can type your questions in the Q&A box and we'll try to answer them as much as we can. I think our panelists are very eager to ask questions. Let me ask the first question. Prasad, do you always register your clinical trial before you start a study? There are now rules from GIE, for instance, if your first patient in actually happened before the registration, the date of registrations, then you have to explain. So do you always register your clinical trials?
I do. In fact, for a clinical trial, which I presume is prospective, before you get IRB approval, the IRB, at least at Mayo Clinic, requires you to register your protocol with clinicaltrials.gov. They need to see that. So before IRB's approval, which means that I can't recruit anyone before the IRB approved my protocol, it's an integral part of that. And I think that just helps in publication as well.
There are two questions. Let me go to those questions later on. The two panelists, Dr. Joy and De Moura, are sitting on the edge of their seats. Let me invite Dr. De Moura to start some questions. He's given me a long list of questions.
Okay, okay. Congratulations, Dr. Prasad. Fantastic presentation. I have a question about the title. The title of a paper is the first thing to read, and its value must not be underestimated. Which features attract the attention of the editor the most? And how can a researcher be sure to have an intriguing title? And the final question about the title, is a question adequate in the title?
Yeah, no, that's a great point to raise. So I think it is, so many journals now actually have rules on what you can and cannot put in your titles. So there is this, the term I would use is declarative versus non-declarative. And many of the journals like gastroenterology or CGH or GI endoscopy don't like declarative titles. So they don't want you to necessarily put the conclusions of your paper in the title. So if you're submitting a randomized clinical trial, you are better off saying effect of X on Y results from a randomized controlled trial. So you're really highlighting the methodology and how you conducted the study, as opposed to saying the conclusion. Now that's very different from the way you would write an abstract. So an abstract for a conference oftentimes tends to be declarative and perhaps be a little bit creative to make it more significant. But I think you should read the instructions to the authors, and many times the editor will actually will change or suggest a change in the author in the title. I have had instances where editors have encouraged me to put for a multi-center study into the title, an international phrase into the title, a trial or a randomized controlled trial into the title. But typically they shy away from actually highlighting the actual result in the title. So I think those are my thoughts. I don't know if other members have thoughts.
I think different journals have their own style. Even the content's the same. They will ask you to phrase your title in a certain way. Typically, a British journal is very different from American journal, for instance. So I agree with you not to have false claims in your title and just to state the actual methodology. I think that is the key. Dr. Joya, do you have burning questions to ask?
No, I mean, very good talk, very sort of insightful in terms of, things that we sometimes ignore when we are writing a paper and then get depressed when it is rejected. A few things from the other side, from the journal side. What is this explosion of emails I'm getting that please submit in this journal? We are short of one paper. And then they say that, okay, if your paper gets accepted, we are going to charge you $2,000 to publish. I mean, there's an explosion of these emails coming, and sometimes I find that there are these journals that are mushrooming, and asking for manuscripts is kind of the flow the other side. The traffic is flowing the other side.
Dr. Loud, would you want me to answer the question, or do you have thoughts?
I get those every single day. They are typically in the spam mailbox, so I don't get to see them anymore. So they are, but yeah, we just tend to ignore.
I think there is a question from Dr. Shaukat talking about how do you distinguish an open access from a predatory journal. I think that sort of we are in some ways entering that part of the discussion in terms of what is predatory and what is open access. And again, I think one of the first thing I would like to do is to actually write in a journal that is at least indexed on PubMed. I think that is one criteria that I would use. That is number one. Number two, most of the journals where you would want to publish are typically not going to charge you upfront for publications. I know gastroenterology charges a fee for sending it out for peer review. There may be some publication charges, but open access journals, for instance, Clinical Translational Gastroenterology, which is the waterfall journal for AJG, is open access, and they do charge you for publication. So I think that sort of, they make that clear upfront. They have a rigorous peer review process, and I think that's what distinguishes, in my mind anyway, a good open access journal from a predatory journal, where you may or may not have peer review. You have no sense of who the editors are, who the reviewers are they indexed on PubMed? And I've even heard things like, if you submit to one of these sort of quote unquote predatory journals, your paper could actually be shared with other people who you may have no idea about. So again, I think we have to try and distinguish open access journals. The AGA has just started an open access journal. And I think you just have to go to the pedigree, perhaps, of who is running the open access journal, and then distinguish that from predatory journals. Again, those are just my thoughts.
Okay.
I have one more question.
Yes.
How important in this affiliation of authors for any article to be accepted?
So could you elaborate on that, Dr. Moura? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. How important is to submit your manuscript to the proper journal? How to make this choice? Did you hear me?
How do you target your journal? Like you have a manuscript, which journal to submit? Yes.
Yeah, I think I hit some of the points during my talk, but really, I think it goes to a few things. So we are all in gastroenterology, but even gastroenterology is divided into endoscopy or general gastroenterology or hepatology. And I think the first thing to identify is the relevant journal in your area. So if you are going to write on endoscopic treatment of obesity, then I think perhaps targeting an endoscopic journal would be the first journal of choice in my mind. It also depends then on what is the impact. Is this really novel? Is this a randomized controlled trial? That might push you to some of the higher impact journals in that field. What kind of audience do you want? Do you want this to be a national audience? Do you want this to be an international audience? And then the last thing in my mind is the impact factor of the journal. The higher the impact factor of the journal, the higher is the bar. So there are just so many things that play into this. And I don't know if there is a formula, but you sort of talk to the senior authors, you talk to some of your mentors, and they will give you this suggestion, I think. I think all of these play a role.
It's often said that when you design a study, you should have a target journal in mind. Do you have something like that? I mean, there are editors from major journals who would say, is this really the article for a certain journal? So when you design a study, do you have a target journal in mind?
Sometimes, I would say sometimes, you know, when I personally design a study, it depends. There are just so many journals out there in my mind. You know, if you talk about, you know, the really high impact journals, New England Journal, Lancet, you know, things like that. And then you have the GI journals, and again, I think it's more than just the design itself, right? It's also the impact. What is its relevance? Does it go beyond gastroenterology? Is it relevant to internal medicine? Is it relevant to a wider audience? So I think there's just so many things that play into which journal that you should submit.
There's a question
Yes,
from the audience. I'm seeing over here. Quang Tran's question is, what are the potential reasons for rejecting a paper after minor revisions?
Mm.
And the same person is also asking, is that does the editor get, or maybe the reviewer gets biased looking at the name of the authors, maybe close friends, and the institution?
Yeah, no, I think those are good questions. I think it should be extremely rare for anything to get rejected after you get a minor revision. Honestly, I think if a journal sets a minor revision, it typically would happen if you want a few sentences changed, you don't want new analyses, you're happy with the conclusions, you're happy with the data. I think the only reason in my mind for a rejection after a minor revision would be something different, whether a conflict of interest was not disclosed, or there's a strong commercial bias, or somebody picks up on plagiarism or something like that. I would really have to see a specific example. Typically, after a minor revision is set, it should be extremely unusual for a paper to get rejected.
Prasad, something that you've not touched on is style of a certain journal.
Mm-hmm.
When I write, I typically would, the journal that's intended for, I typically would go to that journal and find a couple of articles of a similar nature and then study the style.
Yes.
And then come back and sort of emulate the style of that particular journal. Do you do that?
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think it's critically important to read the instructions to authors. That's number one. Number two, maybe read a paper, as you correctly said, in terms of what was maybe closest to what you are going to write and what has been published by that journal. There are certain characteristics that are important. Many of those are caught at the editorial review, but there are certain styles that certain journals, it may be somewhat subtle. And I think, again, in terms of whether you get in or not, I don't think those styles are necessarily going to matter at the first instance. Most of the initial decisions will come on rigor, novelty, and relevance, in my mind. I think we left out this issue of bias at the editor level regarding authors' names, affiliations, and country of origin. I think that is something that is unfortunately difficult to ignore. As editors, we do our best to not be swayed by any of these. At least in GI endoscopy, that is something that is re-emphasized over and over again. And I also alluded to the fact that even when we look at a paper that comes from a non-English speaking country, we really try to hone in on the scientific merit. Again, the three criteria are rigor, novelty, and relevance. But I know of instances where this has been at least postulated. And this is where I think some journals, I know Clinical Translational Gastroenterology has gone to a double-blind review. So neither the reviewers or the editors, and so you're blinded on either side. And again, there are some pluses and minuses to this. And I know the American Foregut Society journal, which is Foregut, has gone to this template where neither the reviewers nor the authors know who is reviewing or who is writing. And maybe this is the fairest way of peer review. It just doesn't, it hasn't gone, I don't think it has spread beyond certain journals, but I could see this happening more and more.
And I also like to add that in the internet, there are actually resources on helping you how to write. Like if I were to write a randomized control studies, I would go to the consort website, and there's a checklist that I can follow. If I were to write an observational study, then I have this stroke website that I can use. So there's a checklist. And the checklist actually provides you a structure. So you just have to fill the columns in, and then at least you have some initial, have an initial draft of the paper. And then I often go back to my paper time and again, and often you find yourself putting too much information in, and then when you start trimming it, and you start to trim it to about 3,000 words, then you're almost there. And this is how I write. Yeah, I also happen to agree with you. Brevity is actually very important, and short sentences, and also start each paragraph with a message, like be like a short summary of what you were going to say in that particular paragraph. And yeah, and also there are certain structures that I follow. For instance, in the discussion, I often start with a summary of that particular paper, and then the next paragraph would be a discussion on the strength of the paper, and the third would be on the limitations or weaknesses of the paper, and then fourth would be on the practical implication, and the fifth on future studies, and so on. So I think it's a good way to write. Initially, you write down headings to each paragraph, and then you just start to fill the boxes, and then you have a full paper. This is how I write. I'm not sure how Dr. Jua and Dr. Moura would write.
You know, everybody has his own style, but the basic theme of writing is exactly what you said. Have to be brief. You cannot have long sentences. You cannot have an introduction going into 3 pages. I sometimes find that when I'm reviewing papers, the discussion goes on and on as though somebody is writing a novel, and it is not very crisp, and that kind of puts you off a little bit. Sometimes there is an overclaim. The study shows this, and they report in the discussion, now we have shown this, which was not substantiated with their methodology. So I think being brief, which is a difficult thing to do for many people, is very important. And I agree that we have to, literally, as James mentioned, for each paragraph, think what you're going to write in this paragraph, almost like a subheading, and then keep it to just, brief this thing.
Right.
There's a question from Akavi that overall, basically the question is, why are we asked to select the reviewers we want to send the paper to, and the reviewers we don't want the paper to go to? And how do you make these selections?
Yeah, so remember, these are not selections, these are suggestions. And I think this goes to so I've been doing this now for 7 years for GIE, and it's not easy to find reviewers because you don't want to send the paper to anyone and everyone. You want it reviewed by someone who has relevant expertise and also is a good reviewer. Because remember, all of us are doing this pro bono. We are not really getting, we are submitting we are really doing this in our free time. And as physicians, we are all getting busier and busier. So finding a good reviewer who gives you constructive feedback is not the easiest job. And sometimes as an associate editor, I will have to go through 5, 6, 7 reviewers to even get 2. Most journals have databases of reviewers, but I think the suggestion of suggesting the intent of suggesting reviewers is to sometimes make it easier on the associate editor or the editorial staff to find a qualified reviewer. It's particularly important when you have niche publications where you may or may not have that breadth of expertise. So it's just to help. And as an associate editor, I don't necessarily take all the suggestions I get. That is just a suggestion. Now, if you really have a conflict with someone who may have a commercial conflict or a philosophical conflict, I think it's reasonable to put that in. But remember, those are always suggestions, not necessarily, they're not going to be followed all the time.
I have a question. I have
yes,
one more
please.
question. is it possible to change the dictator's mind in decision about a paper with a well-constructed discussion? If yes, where is the secret?
So when you say the editor's mind, what are you talking about, the reviewer, or
The
are you
reviewer.
talking? Yeah.
The dictator, sorry, the dictator.
So I think it goes to James's prior point, right? So you want to be balanced. I think what editors and reviewers are looking for is a balanced discussion wherein you are highlighting some of the novelty, the significance of your results. You acknowledge maybe some competing work and viewpoints by others in the field. Not everybody thinks the same way. And I would probably strongly urge authors to not particularly criticize some of the other others who have published. You can compare and contrast, but I think that is important in a discussion. But avoid saying that's not valid, or avoid saying things like this is wrong. I think those are some things that could turn off reviewers and editors. Be balanced in your discussion. Highlight some of your strengths, but don't be hesitant to acknowledge maybe some of the potential weaknesses that you have.
I think it's actually has a negative impact on your paper if you write too much, or if you write something that is not exactly based on the scientific merits of your paper. And I happen to think that the decision whether to accept paper is not solely on the discussion. The majority of it is actually based on the scientific merit of the paper, whether the methodology has been correct, whether the sample size has been calculated correctly, whether the primary outcome, the 95% confidence interval, is sufficiently narrow to say that this is actually quite precise. So these are the things that well, at least I look at, not so much on the discussion. It's really on the science. Not really on. People say the language is important, but I think the language, it may be important, but I think simple language is important, but I think it's mostly on the scientific merits of paper that actually determines whether your paper is being accepted.
And I know, Prasad, you briefly mentioned about studies that come out with negative results. And there is still a reluctance to publish those. I mean, I know that the Red Journal had once a whole issue on studies with negative results. I mean, where it showed no difference or something. But still, I think there are a lot of people who are reluctant to submit those kind of manuscripts, but they may give an important message.
I couldn't agree with you more, Dr. Dua. I think it's so important to not just have positive results, but also negative results. You know, I'm in the process of having reviewed a negative randomized controlled trial. So I think it's important for those results to be out there. And I think having an issue devoted to negative results, I think was a great idea in my mind, which highlights the importance of getting that out there as well. So I think clinicaltrials.gov, one of the intentions of that was to avoid this publication bias, right? So not only are you putting in the details of your study, but you also have to put your results in.
Mm-hmm.
But I still feel that publication is equally important because you know, it's only when you publish that you get into PubMed. And if a reviewer, if an investigator is thinking of doing a study on compound X, it's important for him to know if other investigators have already studied this and it was a negative study. So then you have to either construct your study in a different manner. You either increase the dose or change the design or increase the duration or do something different to get a different result. So I think that's very, very important in my mind.
But when you submit the manuscript, many journals now ask you to submit the protocol. Yes. So you cannot change the protocol. You cannot change the protocol. So I guess there's a saying to writing comes first. when you write the protocol and you are almost done with the paper. So at the end of your trial, then you should have enough data to fill in the blanks, and then you have a complete manuscript. So
yeah, what I meant, James, was if you're designing a new study,
right.
It's important for you to know what the other negative studies were.
Okay.
How were they done? What were their results? And then if you still want to proceed studying the same question, you can then change some of the things so that you don't do the same study and end up with the same result. That's what I meant.
Right. I think that usually this is to say that there isn't a definitive study in the literature, that the earlier study is being too small and so on. So you must have a very good question why you want to continue down the same theme and come up with another study. But I think that a prior registration of clinical trial is actually very, very important. Mm-hmm. And honest reporting is also very important too. Absolutely. I think we are, in fact, running over time. We are 2 minutes past 11. So I think the time actually flies, and I think you all agree with me. It has been a very fantastic session. Dr. Prasad actually gave a very good talk, and the discussion has been very dynamic. So I'd like to end this session by thanking our speaker, Prasad, for an excellent talk, and then also the two panelists for contributing their wisdom and their comments, and also participants for particularly those from Asia. Now is almost 11 in the evening for their participation. Okay, so thank you all. I think I will have to end the session here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks.